The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. on a frozen January morning in 1944. Inside the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Eastern Command bunker buried deep in the Prussian forests, an orderly knocked twice before entering. The Führer was already awake, poring over tactical maps by lamplight. On the other end of the secure line, a Luftwaffe squadron commander's voice cracked with something rarely heard from German pilots. Genuine confusion mixed with grudging respect. "Mein Führer," he began, each word carefully measured. "The Americans have deployed a new fighter group over Italy. They fly red-tailed P-51 Mustangs. They do not break formation. They do not pursue individual glory. And in 6 months of operations," he paused, the silence stretching like a taut wire, "they have not lost a single bomber under their protection." Adolf Hitler's fingers whitened around the receiver. His jaw tightened. "Repeat that." "0 losses, mein Führer. 68 escort missions, not one bomber shot down while under their protection." The receiver clicked as Hitler set it down with unnatural precision. He turned to the officer standing at attention near the doorway. "Bring me everything, every intelligence file, every photograph, every combat report on this unit." His voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of command that had toppled nations. "I want to know who these pilots are." What arrived over the next 72 hours would shatter the very foundation of Nazi ideology and set in motion an obsession that would consume Hitler's final years. The intelligence files landed on his desk in neat folders marked "Classified, Immediate Priority." Inside were reconnaissance photographs, combat after-action reports, and intercepted Allied communications. Hitler spread them across the map table, his hands trembling slightly. The photographs showed them clearly: black American pilots, standing beside their aircraft, laughing, confident, victorious. For 10 minutes, Hitler said nothing. He simply stared at the images, his mind performing calculations that refused to reconcile with 20 years of ideology. His entire political philosophy, the speeches he'd delivered to millions, the theories upon which he'd built an empire, all of it rested on a single premise: the biological superiority of the Aryan race and the inherent inferiority of all others, particularly those of African descent. And now these photographs, these combat reports, this impossible statistic: 68 missions, 0 losses. "Get me Göring," Hitler said finally, his voice hollow. "Now." Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, arrived within the hour, his considerable frame barely fitting through the bunker's reinforced doorways. He found Hitler standing motionless before a wall now covered in photographs and tactical maps, red pins marking each successful American escort mission. "You've seen the reports?" Hitler asked without turning. "Jawohl, mein Führer." Göring's usual bravado was notably absent. "Explain it." Göring shifted his weight. "The Americans have numerical superiority in the Mediterranean theater. Their industrial capacity. Don't insult my intelligence with generalities." Hitler spun to face him, and Göring took an involuntary step backward. The Führer's eyes had that glassy quality his inner circle had learned to fear. The look that preceded purges, sudden dismissals, or worse. "These are Negro pilots, Hermann. Negroes. Flying the most advanced fighters in the world. Protecting American bombers with a success rate that exceeds even our own elite squadrons." He walked to the table, jabbing a finger at the compiled statistics. "Look at these numbers. Our best fighter aces, men we've decorated as heroes of the Reich, are being consistently outperformed by men we've taught our children are subhuman. Explain how this is possible if everything we've built, everything I've written, everything we believe is true." The question hung in the air like poison gas. Göring opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Perhaps the American training program." "Training?" Hitler's laugh was sharp and humorless. "We have the most rigorous training program in history. We have the finest aircraft engineers, the most advanced technology. We have warriors bred for combat over generations." "And you're suggesting that training explains why Negro pilots, men who, according to our scientists, lack the cognitive capacity for complex tactical thinking, are achieving the impossible? Göring had no answer. In the silence, both men confronted the abyss opening beneath their feet. If black pilots could excel at aerial combat, one of the most cognitively demanding military specialties, then the entire racial hierarchy upon which Nazism was built became nothing more than a political convenience, a useful lie. Hitler turned back to the wall of evidence. I want a tactical response developed. I want this unit identified, tracked, and eliminated. Dedicate whatever resources are necessary. Mein Führer, with respect, our strategic priorities. This is a strategic priority. Hitler's voice rose to a shout that echoed off the concrete walls. If word spreads throughout Germany that Negro pilots are defeating our best squadrons, do you understand what that means for morale, for belief in the Reich, for everything we've sacrificed? He placed both palms flat on the table, breathing hard. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something more dangerous than shouting. A quiet, obsessive determination. They cannot be allowed to continue. They cannot be allowed to succeed. Because if they do, Hermann, then everything we've built is based on a lie. And if it's based on a lie, then we've murdered millions for nothing. The truth of it sat between them like a third presence in the room. Göring nodded slowly and left to convene an emergency meeting of Luftwaffe command. But before we understand how Hitler's obsession would escalate into something dark and desperate, we need to know who these pilots were, how they came to be, and why their very existence threatened not just Germany's war effort, but the ideological foundation of the Third Reich. Their story begins 5,000 miles away, in a small town in Alabama called Tuskegee. In 1941, America was a nation at war with itself long before Pearl Harbor forced it to confront external enemies. Racial segregation was not merely legal. It was the law of the land, enforced by violence, defended by politicians, and accepted by millions as the natural order of things. Black Americans could not eat at the same lunch counters as whites, could not attend the same schools, could not vote in most of the South, and certainly could not serve alongside white soldiers in integrated military units. The very idea of black pilots was considered absurd by most of white America's military establishment. In 1940, a report from the Army War College stated explicitly that African Americans were lacking in initiative and mentally inferior to white men, making them unsuitable for leadership positions or technical military specialties like aviation. But political pressure from civil rights organizations, combined with the desperate need for manpower as war approached, forced a compromise. The Army Air Corps would create an experimental program to train black pilots. If they failed, as most white officers expected, it would prove the racial theories correct. If they succeeded, well, the brass didn't seriously consider that possibility. The program was established at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, deliberately placed in the heart of Jim Crow South. The symbolism was clear. These men would be tested in the most hostile environment possible. If they could survive both the training and the racism, perhaps they could survive combat. The first class of cadets arrived in July 1941. They were educated men, college graduates, teachers, athletes, who had grown up being told by their country that they were inferior, incapable, mentally deficient. Many held advanced degrees. All of them burned with something fiercer than ordinary patriotism, the determination to prove, once and for all, that excellence knows no color. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a West Point graduate who had endured 4 years of silent treatment from his white classmates, became the first black officer to solo in an Army Air Corps aircraft. Lieutenant Robert Dees, a former school principal from Chicago, memorized entire technical manuals because he knew he would never be given the benefit of the doubt. Second Lieutenant Charles DeBow, who had been denied entry to his state's university because of his skin color, became one of the program's top marksmen and navigators. They trained twice as hard because they knew they would be judged twice as harshly. They studied late into the night because a single failure would be used as evidence against their entire race. They faced instructors who wanted them to fail, equipment that was often second-rate, and the knowledge that even if they earned their wings, they might never see combat. might spend the war washing dishes or loading trucks because white commanders refused to trust them with aircraft. But they persisted, and on March 7, 1942, the first class of black military pilots in American history received their wings. The 99th Fighter Squadron was activated shortly after. Its first commander was Benjamin Davis, now promoted to lieutenant colonel. Their aircraft were P-40 Warhawks, older, less capable than the P-51 Mustangs they would later fly, but still deadly in skilled hands. They deployed to North Africa in April 1943, attached to white units whose commanders viewed them with open skepticism. At their first briefing, a white colonel looked them over and muttered, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Well, let's see if they can actually fly these things in combat." Their first mission was a disaster, but not for the reasons their critics expected. June 2, 1943. Over the Mediterranean Sea, 12 P-40s from the 99th Fighter Squadron escorted Allied bombers toward targets in Pantelleria, a heavily fortified Italian island. German fighters rose to meet them. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, flown by Luftwaffe veterans with hundreds of combat hours. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. Lieutenant Charles Hall, spotting a FW-190 diving toward an American bomber, pushed his throttle forward and closed the distance. His training took over, smooth, controlled bursts from his .50 caliber machine guns. The German fighter exploded in midair, tumbling toward the sea in pieces. It was the first aerial victory by a black American pilot in U.S. military history, but Hall didn't celebrate. He didn't break formation to claim glory or pursue other targets. He returned to his position in the escort formation and continued protecting the bombers. Every pilot in the 99th did the same. The mission was accomplished. All bombers returned safely. The 99th had 0 losses. It should have been a triumph. Instead, they returned to base to find their white commanding officer filing a complaint that they had been too cautious and lacked aggressiveness. The criticism revealed an impossible standard. Be excellent but not too excellent. Be brave but not too brave. Succeed but do it in a way that doesn't make white pilots look bad by comparison. It was a trap and they knew it. So they made a decision that would change everything. They would focus entirely on the mission, not on personal glory. While other fighter groups competed for individual kill counts, the 99th, and later the 332nd Fighter Group, which absorbed the 99th and other black squadrons, developed a tactical doctrine that was revolutionary in its simplicity. Stick with the bombers no matter what. Other escort fighters would sometimes break off to pursue German aircraft, seeing opportunities for quick kills and personal glory. The Tuskegee Airmen never did. If a bomber was in danger, they stayed. If a German fighter tried to lure them away, they ignored the bait. If completing the mission meant letting an enemy escape, they let him escape. It was boring. It was unglamorous. It was the opposite of the fighter-pilot image, the lone wolf, the ace, the glory hound. And it was devastatingly effective. By late 1943, word had spread among American bomber crews. If you see red tails, you're going home alive. The 332nd Fighter Group, now flying the superior P-51 Mustang, had painted their tail assemblies bright red for identification. It became their trademark, their promise, their threat to the enemy. German pilots began reporting something unusual. These American fighters didn't take the bait. They didn't chase. They didn't break formation for easy kills. It was unnerving, fighting an enemy who seemed to have transcended ego entirely. And the statistics became impossible to ignore. By January 1944, the 332nd had flown 68 bomber escort missions. Not a single bomber under their protection had been lost to enemy fighters. Not one. The mathematical improbability of it was staggering. Other escort groups were losing bombers at rates between 5 and 10% per mission. The 332nd, 0%. This was the information that reached Hitler's desk on that frozen January morning. And this was why, for the next 16 months until his death, the Führer would become increasingly obsessed with a problem he could neither solve nor admit existed. Because the success of the Tuskegee Airmen wasn't just a tactical challenge, it was an existential crisis. The meeting in the Wolf's Lair on January 15, 1944, was supposed to focus on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were pushing German troops back toward Poland. Instead, Hitler spent 90 minutes discussing a single American fighter group. "They're using some new technology," suggested Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. "Perhaps jet propulsion or advanced radar systems we haven't identified." Hitler shook his head slowly, still staring at the photographs spread across the table. "They're flying P-51s, same aircraft other American units fly, same armament, same engines. The technology is identical." "Superior numbers, then," offered Göring, grasping for explanations. "Perhaps they're assigning 3 or 4 fighters per bomber while other units. Their force deployment is consistent with standard American tactical doctrine." Hitler's voice was flat, almost mechanical. He had clearly studied every detail. "The only variable that differs is the racial composition of the pilots." The silence that followed was profound. No one wanted to speak the conclusion aloud. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top fighter aces and a man whose military competence Hitler respected, finally spoke. "Mein Führer, if I may, perhaps we've underestimated the American training program for this particular unit. The Americans may have—" "No." Hitler cut him off. "You're trying to explain away the impossible. Let me be clear about what these numbers mean." He picked up a typed report, his hands shaking slightly, whether from anger or something else, no one could tell. "The 332nd Fighter Group has achieved a bomber protection rate that exceeds any fighter group in history. German, British, American, it doesn't matter. No one has done what they're doing." He set the report down carefully. "And they are Negroes. Men who, according to every scientific measurement we've documented, should be incapable of the split-second tactical decisions required for aerial combat. Men who should lack the spatial reasoning, the reactive speed, the cognitive sophistication for fighter operations. Yet there they are," he continued, his voice rising. "Photographs don't lie. Combat reports don't lie. Mathematics doesn't lie. So either our racial science is completely wrong," he let that hang in the air, "or there's something else at work here, and I want to know what it is." Galland, showing the courage that made him a respected commander, tried again. "With respect, mein Führer, perhaps our racial theories were developed with limited data." The explosion was instantaneous. Hitler slammed both fists on the table, sending papers flying. "Limited data, limited data. We have spent decades measuring skulls, documenting intelligence, proving scientifically the hierarchy of races. We have universities dedicated to this research. We have built an entire civilization on these principles." He was shouting now, spittle flying from his lips. "Are you suggesting that it's all wrong? That we've murdered millions based on faulty science?" No one answered. The question was rhetorical, but its implications were devastating. Hitler seemed to catch himself, pulling back from the edge of complete loss of control. He straightened his uniform with shaking hands. When he spoke again, his voice had returned to that quiet, obsessive tone. "Develop a tactical response. I want this unit targeted specifically. Dedicate resources from the Eastern Front if necessary." "Mein Führer," Keitel protested weakly. "The strategic situation in the East—" "I know the strategic situation," Hitler snapped. "And I know that if word spreads throughout the Reich that Negro pilots are humiliating our Luftwaffe, the psychological impact will be catastrophic. Morale depends on belief. Belief in our cause. Belief in our superiority. Belief that we're fighting for something true and real." He turned back to the photographs. "So you will eliminate them. Not eventually. Not when convenient. Immediately." What followed over the next 6 months was unprecedented. Hitler personally reviewed combat reports from the Italian and later German fronts, tracking the 332nd's operations with the focus he usually reserved for major strategic decisions. When Allied forces landed at Normandy in June 1944, Hitler spent a morning briefing discussing the 332nd's recent missions over France instead of the invasion itself. His generals began to worry, not about the tactical challenge the Tuskegee Airmen presented, though that was real, but about the Führer's mental state. He was diverting reconnaissance assets to photograph the 332nd's airfields. He was pulling fighter squadrons from critical sectors to challenge the Red Tails specifically. He was, in effect, waging a private war against a single American unit. And he was losing. June 9, 1944. The 332nd Fighter Group flew escort for a strategic bombing raid against Munich. German fighters rose in force, nearly 40 Bf-109s and FW-190s. Veterans from the Eastern Front temporarily redeployed specifically to target this mission. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. When it was over, the 332nd had shot down 7 German fighters without losing a single bomber or friendly aircraft. The German pilots reported with a mixture of frustration and respect that the American formation had been unbreakable. The report reached Hitler's desk that evening. He read it 3 times. Then he summoned his personal secretary, Martin Bormann, and dictated a memo, classified at the highest level, to be distributed only to SS leadership. The Negro pilot problem represents a threat to Reich ideology that may exceed immediate military concerns. Conventional tactical responses have proven ineffective. Alternative methods must be explored. Alternative methods was a euphemism that, in the context of Nazi Germany, could mean only one thing: operations outside the normal rules of war. What happened next would remain classified for 50 years after the war ended. Ramatelli, Italy, July 18, 1944. 3:47 a.m. The explosion tore through the maintenance hangar like a hammer of God, the blast wave shattering windows half a mile away. 2 mechanics were killed instantly: Private James Morrison, age 22, from Detroit, and Sergeant William Hayes, age 26, from Philadelphia. 3 P-51 Mustangs were destroyed completely, another 4 damaged beyond immediate repair. Captain Andrew Turner, the 332nd's maintenance officer, reached the scene within minutes to find carnage. The blast pattern was wrong, too focused, too powerful for an accident. The explosive residue analysis would later confirm what he suspected immediately. This was sabotage. He found the evidence tucked behind a support beam 20 feet from the blast center, a detonator, German-made, with Wehrmacht markings still visible on the casing. Turner stood in the wreckage as the sun rose, understanding finally dawning. This wasn't war anymore. This was something darker. The Germans weren't just trying to shoot them down. They were trying to destroy them on the ground because they couldn't beat them in the air. A week later, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis called his squadron commanders together for an emergency briefing. The information he shared had come through intelligence channels, declassified decades later under Freedom of Information Act requests. German agents had infiltrated the Italian resistance networks with specific orders to target the 332nd's ground operations. "They can't beat us in combat," Davis said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "So they're changing tactics, sabotage, targeted attacks on our ground crews. We need to assume every supply shipment is compromised. Every maintenance worker needs vetting. Every aircraft needs inspection before flight." Lieutenant Robert Dees raised his hand. "Sir, has this been reported to higher command?" Davis's expression was carefully neutral. "It has been reported." The response was that we should focus on our missions and let counterintelligence handle security concerns. The unspoken message was clear. Don't expect help. Don't expect additional security. You're on your own. But they adapted. They always adapted. Ground crews began sleeping in shifts near the aircraft. Pilots personally inspected their planes before every mission. Security was tripled through informal, unit-organized measures. And they kept flying. August 24, 1944. The 332nd provided escort for a bombing raid against Luftwaffe airfields in southern Germany. Intelligence had indicated heavy fighter presence, and the Luftwaffe didn't disappoint. Nearly 50 German fighters rose to challenge them. The mission briefing had been tense. Everyone knew this was a deliberate challenge. The Germans had consolidated forces specifically to attack this raid. Someone, somewhere in the Reich command structure, wanted the 332nd bloodied. They wanted a defeat they could publicize. Instead, they got a massacre. The engagement lasted 18 minutes. The 332nd shot down 13 German aircraft confirmed, with another 7 probables. They lost 0 bombers. They lost 0 escort fighters. Every pilot returned to base, though 4 planes were damaged by ground fire. The after-action report reached Berlin within hours, then was hand-delivered to Hitler's field headquarters in East Prussia. The Führer read it in silence. Then he stood, walked to the window overlooking the forest, and stared into the darkness for 10 minutes without speaking. His aide, standing at attention, watched as Hitler's hands clenched and unclenched behind his back. "They're better than we are," Hitler said finally, so quietly the aide almost didn't hear him. "Not luckier, not more numerous. Better, more disciplined, more focused, more effective." He turned, and the aide was shocked to see that Hitler's face was gray, aged 10 years in 10 seconds. If Negroes can excel as fighter pilots, the most cognitively demanding military specialty we have, then everything I've taught Germany is wrong. Everything I've written is lies. Everything we've built, everything we've sacrificed, everything we've done. He trailed off, leaving the thought incomplete, but its implications devastating. "Get me Himmler," Hitler said abruptly. "Tell him I need to speak with him about special operations in Italy. Tonight." Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS and architect of the Holocaust, arrived at midnight. The meeting lasted 2 hours. No official records were kept, but we know what was discussed because of documents discovered in 1994 in a formerly classified Soviet archive, papers seized from the Reich Chancellery by Red Army troops in 1945 and hidden in Moscow for 50 years. The documents revealed that Hitler authorized an SS Sonderkommando, a special unit, to be deployed to Italy with a single mission: eliminate the leadership of the 332nd Fighter Group through assassination, not in combat, not through honorable military engagement, through murder. The order was explicit. Priority targets include command staff, senior pilots, and any personnel whose removal would significantly degrade unit effectiveness. Operations should appear to be partisan or criminal activity to avoid international incident. It was a secret war within the war, one that would claim lives but remain hidden from history for half a century. September 2, 1944. Naples, Italy, 11:30 p.m. First Lieutenant Samuel Bruce, a pilot with the 332nd who had flown 32 successful missions, left a bar in the city center where he'd been meeting friends. He was 24 years old, engaged to be married to his college sweetheart back in Alabama, scheduled to rotate home in 6 weeks. He never made it back to base. His body was found the next morning in an alley 3 blocks from the bar, shot twice in the head at close range, execution style. His wallet was still in his pocket, $60 untouched. His watch was still on his wrist. This wasn't robbery. Pinned to his uniform jacket was a note, written in English with German words mixed in. "Schwarze Flieger werden sterben. Black flyers will die. This is not war. This is purification." The murder investigation went nowhere. Italian police claimed it was likely a partisan attack or organized crime. The U.S. Army classified the incident and ordered all personnel not to discuss it. The official cause of death listed in Lieutenant Bruce's service record was simply killed in action, non-combat circumstances. But the pilots of the 332nd knew the truth, and it changed something fundamental in them. "They're hunting us," Captain William Campbell told Colonel Davis in a private meeting, "not just fighting us, hunting us, like we're animals." Davis's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Then we make ourselves very hard to hunt, and we continue the mission." "Sir, with respect, shouldn't we be asking for additional security? FBI investigation? Something?" Davis was quiet for a long moment. "I've asked. The request was denied. We've been told that resources are limited, and this is likely an isolated incident." "You believe that?" "No, but it doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what we do. So here's what we do. We fly every mission we're assigned. We protect every bomber we're tasked to escort. We prove every single day that we are the best fighter group in the entire Army Air Corps, because that's the only weapon we have that they can't take away. It was a strategy born of necessity and decades of experiencing American racism. When the system is against you, excellence becomes survival. When they want you to fail, success becomes resistance. When they try to erase you, being undeniable becomes defiance. 3 days after Lieutenant Bruce's murder, the 332nd flew a mission escorting bombers to targets in Austria. They encountered heavy resistance. 30 German fighters launched a coordinated attack. The Red Tails shot down 9, damaged 6 more, and once again brought every bomber home safely. The combat report was sent up the chain of command. It crossed desks in Italy, reached headquarters in London, was summarized for Pentagon briefings. Somewhere along that chain, it was also transmitted to German intelligence, then forwarded to Hitler's headquarters. Hitler read it with shaking hands. Then he picked up the telephone. Himmler, the special unit you deployed to Italy. Why are they still flying? Himmler's voice was careful. Mein Führer, we eliminated one of their senior pilots. The operation was successful. 1. You eliminated 1. They have dozens. They're still flying. They're still winning. They're still making us look like fools. We can escalate operations, but this requires time and... I don't have time. Hitler was screaming now, his voice cracking. The Soviets are 40 miles from Warsaw. The Americans are liberating France. The entire Reich is collapsing, and I'm watching Negro pilots prove that everything I've built my life on is a lie. The line went silent for several seconds. When Himmler spoke again, his voice was very quiet. Mein Führer, perhaps we need to consider that our tactical approach to this unit has been ineffective. Perhaps we should redirect these resources toward more critical... No. Hitler's voice had dropped to a whisper which everyone in his inner circle knew was more dangerous than shouting. You misunderstand. This is critical. This is more critical than any single military objective. Because if they succeed, if they continue to succeed, then we have no moral justification for anything we've done. The camps, the laws, the purges, all of it becomes murder for no reason. But mein Führer, the strategic situation. The strategic situation is that my ideology is being destroyed by black American pilots, and if that becomes known throughout Germany, our entire society collapses from the inside. So you will not redirect resources. You will escalate operations. You will eliminate this unit or die trying. Himmler understood there was no point in arguing further. Jawohl, mein Führer. But the escalation never came. Because by October 1944, Germany was losing the war so rapidly that even SS resources couldn't be spared for a vendetta against a single fighter group. The Soviets were approaching Germany's eastern borders. The Americans and British were pushing toward the Rhine. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, out of pilots, out of aircraft. And still, the 302nd kept flying. And still, they kept winning. October 12, 1944. Mission over Blechhammer, Germany, a massive oil refinery complex critical to the Reich's dwindling fuel supplies. The 392nd escorted B-17s through some of the heaviest anti-aircraft fire of the war, then faced a desperate German fighter attack. Nearly 70 aircraft, including some of Germany's new jet fighters, the Me-262s. The jets were faster than anything the P-51s could match. In theory, they should have shredded the American formation. But theory and practice are different things. The 332nd did what they always did. They maintained formation, covered the bombers, and refused to be drawn out of position. When German fighters dove on the bombers, the Red Tails were there. When the jets made their high-speed passes, the P-51s maneuvered to intercept, using teamwork and positioning to compensate for the speed disadvantage. 3 German aircraft were shot down. 2 more were damaged. The bombers reached their target, dropped their payload, and turned for home. Every single B-17 returned safely. The 332nd lost 1 aircraft. Captain Armour McDaniel's P-51 took damage from ground fire, but he nursed it back to base and landed safely. The Reich's oil production dropped 23% that day, and the 332nd had now flown 120 escort missions without losing a bomber to enemy fighters. The combat report reached Hitler's desk as Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance from his command bunker. He read it without expression, then set it down carefully atop a growing stack of similar reports. Martin Bormann, his personal secretary, noted in his diary that day, "The Führer spent the morning meeting discussing aerial combat statistics instead of the Eastern Front. His obsession with the Negro fighter group has become concerning to staff. He refers to them constantly, even when discussing unrelated matters." November 1944. The Battle of the Bulge began, Germany's last major offensive in the West, a desperate gamble to split Allied forces and negotiate a separate peace. It required every available resource, every tactical advantage, every soldier and tank and aircraft Germany could muster. Hitler held a critical planning meeting with his top generals to discuss the offensive. Halfway through the briefing, he interrupted a discussion of supply lines to ask, "Has the 392nd been assigned to support operations in the Ardennes?" The generals exchanged confused looks. Field Marshal von Rundstedt cleared his throat. "Mein Führer, I don't believe their assignment is relevant to our planning. They're one unit among dozens." "Find out," Hitler demanded. "Find out if they'll be operating in the sector. If they are, I want specific tactical plans developed to counter them." "Mein Führer," von Rundstedt tried again. "With respect, we're planning an offensive involving 3 armies, 20 divisions, and—" "I know what we're planning," Hitler snapped. "And I know that if those pilots are there, our fighter support will be ineffective. They've proven that over and over. So find out and plan accordingly." The generals complied, but the looks they exchanged said everything. Their Führer was obsessed, perhaps dangerously so, with an enemy unit that, while effective, represented a tiny fraction of Allied air power. But they didn't understand what Hitler understood. This wasn't about military tactics anymore. This was about confronting the collapse of his entire worldview. Because every mission the Tuskegee Airmen flew successfully was another nail in the coffin of Nazi racial ideology. Every bomber they brought home safely was proof that skin color had nothing to do with capability. Every German pilot they shot down demonstrated that supposed Aryan superiority was a myth, and Hitler knew it. Which is why, even as his empire crumbled, even as Soviet tanks rolled toward Berlin, even as American bombers turned German cities to rubble, he couldn't stop thinking about the pilots with the red tails. December 1944. Hitler moved his headquarters to the Führer bunker in Berlin, a reinforced concrete complex beneath the Reich Chancellery. Soviet forces were now just 80 miles from the city. The Battle of the Bulge had failed. Germany was being crushed from both sides. In the bunker's main conference room, Hitler maintained a large map of the Mediterranean and Western European theaters. Red pins marked the 332nd's known airfield locations. Blue pins tracked their combat operations. A separate sheet documented their statistics: missions flown, bombers protected, enemy aircraft shot down, own losses. His staff found him there late at night, studying the map by lamplight, muttering calculations under his breath. Traudl Junge, one of Hitler's secretaries who survived the war, wrote in her memoir, "In those final months, the Führer seemed less concerned with the advancing Soviet armies than with aerial combat reports from Italy and France. He kept files on a particular American fighter group. I believe they were called the Red Tails, and would spend hours reviewing their operations. It seemed strange to all of us that with Germany collapsing around us, he remained fixated on this single unit." January 1945. The Soviets launched a massive offensive that would carry them to Berlin by April. Hitler, now essentially trapped in his bunker, held increasingly sporadic military briefings. When he did emerge to meet with commanders, his topics of conversation had become disturbingly disconnected from reality. General Heinrici, tasked with defending Berlin's eastern approaches, reported, "The Führer asked me detailed questions about American fighter tactics in the Mediterranean theater. When I attempted to redirect discussion to the immediate threat from Soviet forces 20 kilometers away, he became agitated and insisted we discuss the ideological implications of Negro pilot success." I left the meeting deeply concerned about his mental state. But Hitler's fixation wasn't random or meaningless. In his own twisted way, he understood something his generals didn't. Germany had already lost the military war. The only question remaining was whether Nazi ideology would survive the Reich's defeat. And the success of the Tuskegee Airmen threatened that ideological survival more than any battlefield loss. Because military defeats can be explained. Superior numbers, bad luck, strategic mistakes. But ideological defeat, the proof that your foundational beliefs are simply wrong, that's permanent. February 1945, Soviet artillery was shelling Berlin's outskirts. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine. Germany had weeks, maybe days left. And still, Hitler demanded updates on the 332nd Fighter Group. A courier arrived at the bunker with intelligence reports from the Western Front. Among the documents, a summary of recent American air operations. Hitler seized it immediately, flipping through pages until he found what he was looking for. "They're still flying," he said to no one in particular. "Still succeeding. Still perfect." By this point, the 332nd had flown over 200 bomber escort missions. Their record remained unblemished. Not a single bomber lost to enemy fighters while under their protection. It was a statistic so extraordinary that even Allied commanders had trouble believing it. But Hitler believed it. He had to believe it, because it meant something he couldn't escape. He had been wrong about everything. March 1945. The 332nd flew one of their final major missions, escort for B-17s bombing Berlin itself. It was symbolic in ways that transcended military significance. Black American pilots, men whom Hitler's ideology deemed subhuman, were now flying over the Reich's capital, protecting the bombers that were turning the city to rubble. The Luftwaffe managed to scramble a defensive force, a mixture of inexperienced pilots and exhausted veterans flying on fumes, literally and figuratively. The engagement was brief and one-sided. The 382nd shot down 3 German fighters and drove off the rest. Every bomber completed its run. Every bomber returned safely. The report reached the bunker that evening. Hitler read it, then carefully placed it in a file folder that had grown to several inches thick. Every combat report involving the 332nd that he had accumulated over 15 months. Rokas Misch, Hitler's bodyguard, later recalled, "He sat there for hours just staring at that folder, not reading it, just staring. When I asked if he needed anything, he looked at me and said, 'They've beaten me, Rokas. Not militarily, ideologically. They've proven I was wrong about the most fundamental thing.' Then he went back to staring." April 1945. The Soviets entered Berlin. The bunker shook constantly from artillery impacts. Supplies were running out. Most of Hitler's staff had either fled or were preparing to flee. The Third Reich had perhaps 72 hours left to exist. And Hitler spent those hours reviewing the files on the Tuskegee Airmen. Traudl Junge found him in his private quarters, surrounded by photographs, combat reports, and statistical analyses. He looked up as she entered. "Do you understand what this means, Fräulein Junge?" He gestured to the papers surrounding him. "I built a philosophy. I wrote books. I gave speeches to millions. I created laws. I started a war. I killed millions of people. And all of it, was based on the premise that some races are superior to others. That biology determines capability, that Aryans represent the pinnacle of human evolution." He picked up a photograph showing Captain Wendell Pruitt standing beside his P-51 Mustang, smiling, victorious. "But this man," Hitler continued, his voice hollow, "and men like him have proven conclusively that I was wrong. They didn't just fight well. They fought better than my best pilots. They didn't just succeed, they achieved perfection. 200 missions without a single failure." He set the photograph down carefully. "Which means everything I built was based on a lie. Which means I murdered millions for nothing. Which means my life's work was not a glorious achievement, but rather history's most catastrophic mistake." Junge didn't know what to say. Hitler returned to studying the documents, and she quietly left. April 22, 1945. Hitler held his final military briefing. The meeting dissolved into chaos as generals admitted there were no reserves left, no hope of relief, no possibility of victory. Hitler dismissed everyone except his closest aides. He dictated his political testament, a document attempting to justify his actions and shift blame for Germany's defeat. In the original handwritten draft, discovered years later, there was a paragraph that never made it into the final version. It read, "The greatest error of my life was underestimating the capabilities of non-Aryan peoples. The success of Negro pilots in the American Air Force proved that racial superiority is a myth. I built a Reich on sand, and it has collapsed not because of military failure but because of philosophical failure." Someone, likely Bormann, convinced him to remove that paragraph before the final version was typed. Can't admit the central premise was wrong, even at the end. April 28, 1945. The Soviets were 3 blocks from the Chancellery. Hitler made his final appearances above ground, briefly inspecting a group of Hitler youth preparing to die defending the bunker. He returned underground and asked for a final report on American air operations. The report noted that the war in Europe was essentially over. Allied air forces had achieved total air superiority. Among the units listed as active in the final days, the 332nd Fighter Group, still flying missions, still protecting bombers, still maintaining their perfect record. Hitler read the report 3 times. Then he placed it carefully atop the thick file he'd maintained for 15 months. He tied the entire collection together with string, as if preserving it for posterity, and set it aside. April 30th, 1945. 3:30 p.m. Adolf Hitler retreated to his private quarters with Eva Braun, whom he had married the day before. They both took cyanide capsules. Hitler also shot himself with his service pistol to ensure death. When aides entered the room, they found the bodies. They also found on Hitler's desk that tied bundle of documents, every report, every photograph, every statistical analysis related to the Tuskegee Airmen. The top document was the most recent report, dated that morning, noting that the 332nd had completed another successful mission. In a final cruel irony, Hitler died knowing that even in the Reich's last hours, those pilots, the ones whose very existence destroyed his ideology, were still flying, still succeeding, still perfect. The Soviet soldiers who captured the bunker seized thousands of documents. That particular bundle was catalogued, analyzed, and eventually placed in Soviet military archives, where it remained classified for 50 years. When it was finally released in 1995, historians were stunned by its contents. Meticulous tracking of a single American fighter unit, annotated in Hitler's own handwriting, demonstrating an obsession that bordered on madness. But was it madness? Or was it something else? The dawning realization that he had dedicated his life to a lie, killed millions for a fantasy, and destroyed a nation chasing an illusion. The Tuskegee Airmen never knew about Hitler's obsession with them. They were too busy flying missions, protecting bombers, and surviving both combat and American racism. When the war ended on May 8, 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group had flown 1,578 combat missions. They had destroyed 261 enemy aircraft. They had damaged or destroyed countless ground targets. They had earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, 744 Air Medals, and 8 Purple Hearts. And they had maintained their record. In 200 bomber escort missions, not a single bomber was lost to enemy fighters while under their protection. It remains one of the most remarkable achievements in military aviation history. But when they returned to the United States, they came home to a country still deeply segregated. They couldn't eat in the same restaurants as the white pilots they'd served alongside. They couldn't attend the same schools. They couldn't vote in much of the South. Many couldn't get jobs as commercial pilots because airlines refused to hire black aviators. Captain Charles McGee, who flew 136 missions with the 332nd, later recalled, "We'd proven ourselves in combat. We'd achieved the impossible. and we came home to signs that said, "Whites only." It was like the war we'd just won didn't matter. But it did matter. It mattered enormously. The Tuskegee Airmen had done something no legislation or court ruling could achieve. They had proven, undeniably and permanently, that the racial theories used to justify segregation were scientifically false. They had demonstrated that excellence knows no color, that capability isn't determined by skin tone, that human potential can't be limited by prejudice. Their success became ammunition for the civil rights movement. When segregationists claimed Black Americans were inferior, activists pointed to the Tuskegee Airmen. When the military resisted integration, President Truman pointed to the 303 seconds record. When airlines refused to hire Black pilots, lawsuits cited the combat achievements of men like Benjamin O. Davis and Charles McGee. In 1948, just 3 years after the war ended, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the integration of the U.S. military. The Tuskegee Airmen's record was cited explicitly in the justification. In 2007, President George W. Bush invited the surviving Tuskegee Airmen to Washington and awarded them the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. Hundreds of elderly men, many in their 80s and 90s, stood in the Capitol rotunda as the president spoke. They risked everything for their country, Bush said, even as their country didn't always respect them. They proved that a person should be judged by the content of their character and the courage of their convictions, not by the color of their skin. The surviving pilots wept. Not because of the medal, though that was meaningful, but because they were finally being recognized for what they'd known all along. They were American heroes who had helped win the greatest war in history. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came not from America, but from an unexpected source. In 2012, a German military historian named Klaus Schmieder published a paper analyzing Wehrmacht combat records from 1944-1945. Among his findings, multiple references to specific orders regarding the 302nd Fighter Group, including directives to prioritize engagement with red-tailed American fighters and to dedicate additional resources to countering Negro pilot units. The orders came from the highest levels of Nazi command, in some cases from Hitler personally. Schmieder's conclusion: the Nazi leadership viewed the success of Black American pilots not merely as a tactical challenge, but as an existential ideological threat. They dedicated disproportionate resources to countering this single unit, even as the Reich collapsed around them. This obsession, documented in hundreds of military communications, suggests that Nazi leaders understood their racial theories were being disproven in real time by the very people they had deemed inferior. In other words, the Nazis knew they were wrong, and it terrified them. The story of Hitler's obsession with the Tuskegee Airmen is really 3 stories woven together. First, it's a story of extraordinary military achievement. The 390 seconds record speaks for itself. 200 bomber escort missions without a single loss to enemy fighters remains unmatched in aviation history. It required discipline, skill, tactical brilliance, and courage beyond measure. Second, it's a story of ideological collapse. Hitler built an empire on the premise of racial hierarchy. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't just challenge that premise, they demolished it. Every mission they flew, every bomber they protected, every German fighter they shot down was another brick pulled from the foundation of Nazi ideology. Hitler's obsession wasn't random or crazy. It was the desperate flailing of a man watching his life's work proven false by the very people he deemed subhuman. Third, it's a story about the power of excellence as resistance. The Tuskegee Airmen couldn't change American racism through force. They couldn't legislate equality. They couldn't demand respect. But they could fly. They could succeed. They could be undeniable. And in being undeniable, they changed everything. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who commanded the 382nd and later became the first Black general in the U.S. Air Force, summed it up best in a speech he gave in 1995, 50 years after the war ended. "We didn't set out to change the world. We set out to fly combat missions. But in doing so, we proved something that needed proving, that human capability isn't limited by race, religion, or any other arbitrary characteristic. We proved it to the Germans, who eventually stopped underestimating us. We proved it to our own country, which eventually had to confront its own prejudices. And most importantly, we proved it to ourselves and to future generations of Black Americans who had been told they couldn't, they shouldn't, they wouldn't. He paused, and a smile crossed his weathered face. Hitler spent his final days obsessed with us. I consider that a victory as significant as any aerial combat. We didn't just beat his military, we destroyed his ideology by simply being excellent at what we did. The lesson transcends World War II and even transcends race relations. It's a lesson about truth versus ideology, about reality versus theory, about how the universe has a way of correcting falsehoods no matter how powerfully those falsehoods are enforced. Hitler could command armies, control media, pass laws, and build death camps. But he couldn't make his racial theories true. He couldn't prevent black pilots from excelling. He couldn't stop reality from contradicting his worldview. And when reality and ideology collided at 25,000 feet over Germany, reality won every single time. That's why he spent his final days obsessed with the Tuskegee Airmen. Not because they were militarily decisive, though they were highly effective, but because they were ideologically catastrophic to everything he'd built his life upon. They proved, beyond any possible doubt, that he was wrong. And in the end, being proven wrong by those you've deemed inferior might be the ultimate defeat, more crushing than any military loss, more permanent than any battlefield surrender, more devastating than any occupation or imprisonment. The Tuskegee Airmen destroyed the Nazi ideology more thoroughly than any bomb or bullet ever could. They did it simply by being excellent, by refusing to be limited by others' prejudices, by proving that truth will always outfly hate. Captain Roscoe Brown, who shot down a German jet fighter and flew 68 combat missions, put it most simply in an interview decades after the war. "We just wanted to serve our country. We wanted to prove we were as good as anyone else. And we did. The fact that it drove Hitler crazy?" He smiled. "Well, that's just a bonus." The story of Hitler's obsession with the Tuskegee Airmen reminds us that excellence is not just achievement, it's resistance. That truth is not just a concept, it's a weapon. And that sometimes the most powerful way to fight injustice isn't through violence or rhetoric, but through simply being undeniably, excellently, perfectly yourself. The men of the 332nd Fighter Group climbed into their cockpits every day knowing they were fighting two wars, one against Nazi Germany and one against the prejudices of their own nation. They won both wars. One ended in 1945 with Germany's surrender. The other continues still, but with every milestone of racial progress, the victory of those pilots becomes more complete. Hitler spent his final days obsessing over Black American pilots because they represented his worst nightmare, proof that his entire worldview was built on lies. He died knowing he'd been wrong about the most fundamental thing, and that knowledge probably tormented him more than the military defeat surrounding him. The Tuskegee Airmen, meanwhile, went on to long and productive lives. They became teachers, engineers, businessmen, doctors, lawyers. They raised families. They contributed to their communities. Some, like Benjamin O. Davis Jr. and Daniel Chappie James Jr., became generals. Others returned to civilian life and fought for civil rights with the same determination they'd shown in combat. And every one of them carried the knowledge that they had achieved something extraordinary. They had proven that human excellence recognizes no boundaries of race, that skill and determination and courage belong to all people, and that truth, real truth, mathematical truth, undeniable truth, will always triumph over ideology in the end. That's why their story matters. That's why it must be remembered. That's why Hitler's obsession with them reveals not madness but the inevitable crisis that occurs when reality destroys ideology. The Tuskegee Airmen flew. They fought. They won. They proved. They changed history. And somewhere in a Soviet archive gathering dust for 50 years, sat a bundle of documents tied with string. The meticulous record of one man's obsession with the pilots who destroyed his life's work simply by being excellent at theirs. Truth, as it turns out, really does outfly hate. Every single time. At 25,000 feet and 400 miles per hour, in red-tailed P-51 Mustangs, flown by men who refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose on them. They were the Tuskegee Airmen, and they were, quite simply, the best.